Now, Lindsey German is come onto the call. We have obviously this issue of Afghanistan has been the main story this week, and I've tried to get a good panel of people to speak about the various issues involved. Lindsey, are you there?
Hi, Crispin. Yeah, hi everyone.
And you're on a houseboat, so
I'm on a canal boat. Yes,
canal boat.
Yes.
Right, great. That's great. Now that we've just been talking about Tony Blair's decision to come into this. There's another article in the Observer here. Withdrawal will have every jihadist group cheering. How do you see Tony Blair's role in this? In the whole thing that's just developed now?
Well, I think we've got to look back to before the start of the Afghan war. Tony Blair went to Chicago in 1999 and made a speech advocating humanitarian intervention. As he said, when 9/11 happened, he made a speech at the TUC when he said, this is the chance to reorder the world. So he was absolutely in the vanguard of wanting to go to war with Afghanistan. We said at the time there was no justification for going to war with Afghanistan, that actually none of the hijackers of 9/11 were anywhere near Afghanistan. Bin Laden was there. Actually, the Taliban, under pressure from Iran, did say they would give up Bin Laden as a criminal. We didn't need to go to war. We didn't need to go to war over that. It was already a prelude for going to war with Iraq. And of course, what happened is that when we talk about the lies told about Iraq, in a way, as many lies have been told about Afghanistan, because the Taliban were very quickly defeated. And then we were told, we're getting a new government. It's all going to be fantastic. There'll be peace and democracy. That was never the case. And even when we talk about the humanitarian rights and particularly education of women and girls, very, very limited. And the war continued, and this is what we've seen for 20 years, and we see the results now with this very speedy victory of the Taliban, which people say, oh, this is because the Americans should have stayed there longer, and this is what Blair is saying, that he shouldn't have talked about the forever wars and all this sort of thing. But actually the Americans have been negotiating with the Taliban for several years now to get a power sharing agreement in Afghanistan. So they knew this was going to be happening. They just didn't understand the speed and the strength with which the Taliban were growing, but they were perfectly prepared to deal with them. So there's a massive amount of hypocrisy, apart from anything else, going on here, not least from Tony Blair. We won't be surprised to hear.
Now, I was hoping we'd have Mohammed Asif on, who is a refugee from Afghanistan. I can't actually see him on the call, and I'm trying to get hold of him. But I was interested to hear your view on, the Taliban and what danger they pose as a humanitarian risk to people in Afghanistan, and what withdrawing would involve, and whether we should have stayed longer and all that kind of thing.
Well, to me, the Taliban, as I said, were defeated incredibly quickly. By the end of 2001, the war started in October. By December, the Taliban were gone. Now, they went into retreat in the mountain areas and so on. The real question to ask is how come they can come back with such strength 20 years later if everything was going okay in Afghanistan? And the truth is, you had a totally corrupt and unrepresentative government. You had the Taliban, sure, are an organization which I think none of us who have the sort of values that we have would support. But on the other hand, they did have support in substantial parts of the country. The people they were fighting when we intervened 20 years ago, the Northern Alliance, who became the government effectively, had an equally bad record on human rights. So what you got was America and Britain supporting one side. This side turned out to be more and more unpopular. As the Taliban grew, the Americans relied more and more on airstrikes. When people talk about the situation of women in Afghanistan, which is very, very dangerous for many, many women there, let's remember 70% of the casualties of the airstrikes were women and children. So this is what we're talking about. We created a situation which we made worse. And we defeated the Taliban once very, very easily, but the situation we built afterwards allowed them to come back. So I think staying there any longer would have been a huge mistake. The Americans did it in an absolutely craven way. They left Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without even telling the Afghan army. Well, that's obviously a fairly appalling thing to do, and the base was looted before the Afghan army knew what was going on. I mean, they just cut and run. That's what they did. So, okay, they shouldn't have done that, but should they have stayed? No, I think they were just making the situation worse. And I think now the Afghans, it may descend into another war again. I mean, that is quite possible because there's all sorts of warlords in different parts of the country who will want to fight the Taliban. But the truth is as well that only the Afghan people are going to be able to decide their future. The Americans didn't succeed in doing it. The Russians beforehand didn't succeed in doing it. The British, who were there in around the First World War and back in the 19th century, didn't succeed in doing it. And I think it's, to me, the big tragedy is if we'd spent more than $1 trillion, which America spent on the war, on development, infrastructure, education, and all sorts of other things in Afghanistan, it wouldn't be one of the poorest countries in the world. And we would actually see a country which was able to develop some kind of civil society and politics in a way that hasn't been the case up to now.
Right. Yeah. And obviously America's interference when Russia had invaded or intervened in Afghanistan, they were supporting the Taliban, weren't they? So they kind of built up the Taliban themselves.
They supported the Mujahideen, which was
Mujahideen that became,
the CIA funded the Mujahideen. Yeah. I mean, you've got to look at these things. Somebody earlier referred to Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. There's no question that is the case. And one of the reasons the Taliban has been successful is they're identified with national independence. Now, whatever you think about them, they say we are fighting the invader. And that certainly has some traction with a lot of people who do not like the invader. We should remember Donald Trump, when he was president, dropped the mother of all bombs, as it was called, on Afghanistan, which was the closest thing to a nuclear bomb that wasn't actually a nuclear bomb that you could get. Now, this is the kind of thing that the Afghan people have had to put up with, plus corruption, plus all sorts of other things. It's not surprising that they don't want the Americans there. They don't want the British there. And the British stuff is frankly pathetic. I mean, I thought the debate in Parliament was frankly pathetic. The British cannot even organise an independent evacuation of refugees from Kabul without the Americans. That is the honest truth of the matter. So this is the kind of talk from Tom Tugendhat and these people, and unfortunately from Lisa Nandy and some others on the Labour side, is absolute fantasy, to tell the truth.
Right. I might come back to you in a bit, but I've got. I'm just going to bring in David McMullen, who served in Afghanistan for the British Army. Is that right, David?
Yeah. Hi. Good morning. Yeah. When I was much younger, I served on Herrick 7, which was October 2007 till April 08 with the Rifles.
And what did you think? What did you think when you were in Afghanistan about the situation there, and what was the response to the army being in there, and how antagonistic was that towards Afghanistan, people in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, it was never going to be a success. These are a tribal country. There's 19 different tribes, all with their own, views and demands. If you look and compare it to Northern Ireland and how long. And I use the word peace loosely, that's taken to bring some stability. And that was, Catholic and Protestant. So if you imagine how complicated it is out in Afghanistan, you have, tribes out there who didn't even know that the war in Russia had finished, and thought that we were still Russians in Afghanistan because they were so out of the political loop. But it was never going to be successful. And that's the sad reality of it. We should have invested a lot more in educating people, a lot more in the infrastructure. But England needs to stop wading around the world and thinking it's still an empire. And I think, this just highlights how our foreign policy is flawed, and that we should be actually doing a lot more humanitarian work. We have fantastic engineers, medics, people like that, logistics. Wouldn't it be better if we went into Haiti and built houses and things like that? We might actually be liked around the world rather than trying to force democracy on people.
And I mean, obviously, what kind of toll did it take on people that you were serving in the army with? I mean, there must have been lots of casualties and trauma from going over there. I mean, the toll it took to go out there. I mean, how does it feel now that they've just gone out without any success in any kind of way, keeping the country? It's not improved anything, has it really?
No, I mean, if I'm honest, I think the biggest impact and toll was on the Afghan people, which I guess we shouldn't lose sight of. But from a veteran perspective, absolutely, nearly 500 killed, 10 times that seriously injured, countless more with mental disabilities like PTSD, and still dealing with the effects of that. Two para obviously out there dealing with some horrific things and having to rescue babies from the crush and pick and choose who potentially lives and dies, and that's bound to have an impact on them as well. But coming back from the first point, you know, the biggest impact, which I think some of your guests have already mentioned, is on the Afghan people, and we shouldn't really lose sight of that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for coming. I wanted to move on a bit to the situation with refugees from Afghanistan, and Aamer Anwer. Are you there, Aamer?
Yes, Christian. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Now, you were part of that great protest in Glasgow in May, where you stopped the immigration van from taking the two refugees. What's the situation in Scotland and across the country? I mean, in England as well. I mean, how many people are we letting in as refugees, and what do you think we can do to improve that?
Well, I think in the first instance, the situation is going from bad to worse. There was just recently a decision at an immigration court where the judge ruled that it was safe for an Afghan asylum seeker to return back to Afghanistan, and that he could relocate in Afghanistan. So it's horrific. And the question that's really been asked is, how many other asylum seekers is this happening to? Because the Home Office is continuing to instruct. So they have, on one level, you have a UK government, you know, there's pandemonium, everybody's watching the TV pictures, knowing exactly what's going on in Afghanistan. Yet at the same time, Home Office officials are opposing, as I understand it, asylum status and fighting it in the court. So that's the first issue. The second issue, of course, is that, you know, this hurrah, you know, this shows Britain up, you know, we saw the front page of the Daily Mail about 20,000 Afghan asylum seekers being allowed, and you're going, 20,000, what they mean is 5,000 a year for the next 4 years. That's actually what it means in reality. In terms of when you talk about everybody, I mean, the hypocrisy of Priti Patel turning around and saying to Europe that they need to do their share. Well, let's talk about the closest country to Afghanistan, which has taken millions of asylum seekers from Afghanistan, millions of refugees. You know, we're doing absolutely nothing. You know, this country does need to open up its door, but then it really comes down to the question of, which destroys Priti Patel's argument, in that, you know, people have to go to recognize roots, and anybody coming into this country will be denied asylum. As long as I've known, and I think probably many of your listeners have known, going back the last 100 years, people who are claiming refuge, you know, fleeing from persecution, fleeing from starvation, fleeing from you know, civil war, do not come through safe routes. There's no established corridor in which you can do that. So of course now you have a situation in Afghanistan that just shows how the whole asylum policy for the UK government is an absolute shambles, in that, you know, they will have to cross countries, they will have to cross mountains and rivers and seas in order to get to this country. And we should open up the door, because it's all very well spending, as Lindsey German said earlier on, you know, £1 trillion, you know, on the occupation and the bombing of the Afghan people over 20 years. If they'd actually pumped that money into these countries, into countries like Afghanistan, people wouldn't really want to come. You know, people wouldn't want to leave their home. They wouldn't want to come to this country, to be abused and told that you don't have a right to work, that you're sponges, that you're scroungers, that, you know, that you're the enemy within. Absolutely not. It's the same for Iraq. It's the same for, you know, Libya. It's the same for Syria. People didn't want to be forced to get up and leave their homes. They forced to get up and leave their homes. When you see those pictures of that mother handing her baby across to the American troops over the barbed wire, that tells you what you need to know. Because of course we're no different. You know, if it happened to us, then we would want to flee. And it's sad to say that this government is not to be trusted. We know that this government will not open up the doors, but we need to keep the pressure on, because it exposes all of the asylum process. Because when people are looking at Afghanistan, we should not forget that at the same time, we have people from Syria, people from Iraq, people from Libya, people from countries in Africa that are desperately fleeing civil war and starvation. This is not just something unique to Afghanistan. I also think, the rank hypocrisy of the West and those who have all of a sudden become for women's liberation. You consider the fact, what about Saudi Arabia? Everything that is being operated in by the Taliban in Afghanistan was taught to them by the Wahhabi-led Saudi Arabian despots that control Saudi Arabia. They were funded and trained not just by the British and by the likes of Tony Blair from his time, but also Saudi Arabia. And we're not seeing any call for interventions into Saudi Arabia. Of course not, because they control their oil. The oil comes into that factor, and then you see it in other countries where women do not have liberation. There is no freedom. And it also comes back to me for this is like, I am sickened and sick to the back teeth and tired of watching all these so-called believers in women's freedom and uproar and horror. The vast majority of Afghanistan didn't have that freedom. They didn't have that freedom outside Kabul. 71% of the country lives, in rural areas. They never got, 73%. Inequality in Afghanistan. People are saying, why do they want to come here? It's actually worse than 20 years ago. The richest 10% of people in Afghanistan earn 43% of the incomes. And that is the legacy of a US and UK occupation. So when you see that headline you put up just before, Crispin, about, Tony Blair saying that, we're a second-rate world power. We've always been a second-rate world power since the Second World War. We're in hock with the United States, and the United States have imposed a regime that left services and jobs open to privatization market, and you had a government in Afghanistan that wasn't some sort of democratic institution. It was corrupt. When you see the president of the country allegedly fleeing on a helicopter with 120 million pounds of the people's money, you know exactly what's going on. And that, I think, to an extent explains the total collapse of the Afghan army in the face of Taliban's assault. Because this is a regime prior to the Taliban that most ordinary people go, well, what's really the difference? Because it might be all right for the middle classes to say, yes, absolutely, there was changes. There was university, women were in government, women were, journalists, women were able to walk down the streets, but that was in Kabul. Things hadn't really changed a huge amount outside Kabul. And for people when they're starving, I suppose the question that comes down to this is, as an Afghan, do you trust the Taliban who say they will kill you, or do you trust a foreign power saying that they will protect you? Because the actions of the foreign powers have shown no difference to when they were bombing them 20 years ago, or to when in the last 2 years they said they're supporting, the Afghan, army that were continuing to raid and kill civilians in bombings, in routine night raids of villages. Human Rights Watch reported in 2019, at a time, 2019, 2020, and 2021, this country was refusing Afghan asylum seekers. But Human Rights Watch reported about the indiscriminate airstrikes, talked about the corruption, talked about, rape, talked about everything that was going on in Afghanistan before the Taliban just took control. That has been happening for the last several years. And that's why people from Afghanistan were trying to escape into this country. And it's going to get worse. It is going to get worse. The tragedy, when you see Greece putting up border fences as though somehow, these are human beings, and then people trying to be selective. As in, some people deserve more compassion than some others. Some women will deserve more compassion than others. What about the LGBT community? What about people are talking about the interpreters who worked in the British Army? What about all Afghanistan who do not want to live under the Taliban? Also, it's not just a question of living under the Taliban. It's the fact that they know that things are about to get a lot worse as well. You already had a regime that ripped off the country. People were starving. People were living under total deprivation. And now it's a case of they know what the Americans and British are going to do, because that's the only way they always respond. Unless, of course, the Taliban do a deal over that pipeline. Because I can see that coming, because several years ago, the only reason why they ended up not doing a deal with the Taliban was because the Taliban turned around and said to America, we're not doing a deal with you. And the next thing that came was bombings and interventions. The bottom line here is, the Taliban, of course, are not to be trusted, but I suspect very much that they will see the writing on the wall that the best way of making sure the Americans and British don't intervene is business, money, what Tony Blair knows best. That's why he's done oil deals in the desert. That's why he sat with Saudi Arabia and wrestling, and they'll do the same again. And in the meantime, they won't care about the Taliban crushing their own people, the same way they don't actually give a damn about Saudi Arabia doing exactly the same to their own people and exactly the same to women.
Wow, Aamer, you've gone through so much. You explained so much there. It looks like Mohammed Asif is not coming on, but you've given a very good description of what's happening and the hypocrisy around this sort of fear of the Taliban. When as you say, it's not just the Taliban. I mean, the foreign forces have been just as unhelpful as anything else. So,
Chris, can I just say as well? I mean, I think there's also one issue here. I mean, my family are half Pathan and live in the sort of Pushtun area on the northwestern frontier. And one thing, what was known is that people are now talking about, a response. What is the solution? And people are just talking about a response and solution to the Taliban. What about the last 20 years? The Taliban has survived. I don't have any sympathy for the Taliban, absolutely not. But the Taliban survived as an armed opposition, and we need an explanation for that. Why have they survived the last 20 years? The United States and its puppet government never managed to crush it. And, some reports say that the Taliban has 100,000, fighters. These people were recruited in rural areas that were impoverished, that were bombed, that were tortured and terrorized by Afghan and occupation soldiers, and in refugee camps across the border into Pakistan. And that to a lot of those Afghans, the Taliban look like an alternative or a chance to hit back. It's no different in terms of the Mujahideen. And it will play the same role this time round because they'll say they're an alternative to the corruption of a regime. And that, I think, at the end of the day is where it comes down to. Afghanistan hasn't just suffered just now. It hasn't just suffered the last 20 years. It's like Lindsey said, 43 years since Russia invaded. And at that time, the community rose up. And the real issue is going to come down to, it's going to be ordinary people. We cannot rely on the West or any imperialist intervention to provide some form of solution, because even in 20 years, they never even managed to build up the infrastructure that people would feel confident that this is our democracy, that these are our government, that these are our people. It's not about controlling, resources in that country. The communists, the Stalinists said they wanted to modernize Afghanistan. They did it from top down, and the people said no. And the same situation arises now, that we will start to see the same sort of arguments developing as they've developed 20 years, 10 years ago, and again.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Aamer. I know you're busy. Good to see you.
Thanks, of course.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And Lindsey, I wanted to bring you back in, Lindsey. What do you think about what Aamer said, and also David?
Well, I very much agree with what people have been saying. I mean, what Aamer's been saying and what David was saying. I think that this, there's a lot of talk about this as if this suddenly happened, as if there was this perfect democracy in Afghanistan, which somehow this awful Taliban just come along and managed to overthrow it and establish their own regime. That isn't what's happened at all. There has been a gradual breakdown of whatever the best point of the Western occupation was, if you like, in terms of establishing the government and so on. It's gradually broken down. It's broken down because it's corrupt, because it doesn't do anything for ordinary people, and because the people there have suffered 20 years of war. I mean, to listen to the British Parliament, you would not think a war had been going on. You would not think that people have been suffering from raids in the villages where the men disappear and the women are all harassed by the troops that go in. You wouldn't think that the Afghan army, very large numbers of them, have handed over their weapons to the Taliban. Very large numbers. That what the Taliban said to them in large numbers was, we'll give you the money to go home to your village if you give us your arms and just go. Lots and lots of them did it. That tells you something. It tells you that they had no confidence in their own government or in the US to protect them. And they were perfectly happy to do that. Now, this is a situation where society, far from being built up over the last 20 years, has been in a state of permanent crisis, permanent crisis and conflict all the time. And, we talk about refugees. It's very, very important that we do everything we can to get the maximum number of refugees who want to come out of Afghanistan to come. But even before all this, Afghans were one of the biggest groups of refugees in the world. Most of them never get past Pakistan or Iran or any of the neighboring countries, but they're a huge proportion of refugees, even in the so-called much better times in Afghanistan. Why is that? And why is it that the British government's attitude is we just send these people back? We think, Afghanistan's not a safe place for British citizens. It's not a safe place for American soldiers, but it's a safe place for Afghans to be returned who've been traumatized as refugees. It's a complete disgrace, really.